Hey dude, tonight's myth is a weird one. The kind of story that sounds like it was made up by someone half asleep under an olive tree. So picture this. You're just a regular farmer in ancient Greece. You've got a goat. Nothing fancy, except this goat sings. Yeah, like actually sings. One day you're out in the fields, the goat starts doing its thing. And suddenly, the god Apollo hears about it. And Apollo, god of music, the sun, and being extremely full of himself, doesn't love the competition. Especially not from a farm animal. Greek myths aren't always about heroes or monsters. Sometimes they're about jealousy, about fragile egos, about gods throwing divine tantrums over a goat who maybe had a better voice. Before we slip into this strange little story, hit that like button and subscribe if you're into sleepy mythology. That feels a little too human. And let me know in the comments, what time is it where you are, and how close are your eyes to closing? Now turn the lights low. Get comfortable. If there's someone near you, tell them softly. Don't worry, I'd never leave you for a goat. If you're alone, same dude. Let's just hang out. Close your eyes. And let's drift back to a time when gods got petty and goats stole the spotlight. There are myths everyone remembers. The dramatic, the divine, the violent. But some stories unravel not with thunder, but with the soft scrape of a loom. This is one of those stories. It begins not in Olympus or in war, but in the dim back room of a village home. One that smelled of wool, ash, and old grief. And there, hunched over her weaving, sat Eudora, grandmother of the infamous Arachne. You've likely heard of Arachne, the proud mortal who dared to rival Athena in skill, and paid dearly for it. But before Arachne ever challenged the gods, before she ever picked up a spindle, there was Eudora. A name history barely whispered, and yet it was her hands, calloused, slow, and deliberate, that began the pattern of quiet defiance. Eudora lived in the region of Lydian Sardis, not far from the trading routes that carried spices and tales. She was born into poverty, a life of bread crusts, soot-dark walls, and shared blankets. Her husband, a shepherd, died young, taken by wolves or winter. No one knew. She raised her children alone, earning copper coins for weaving plain cloth, for the merchants who passed through. It wasn't glorious, but it kept the oil lamp burning. The loom was not merely a tool for Eudora, it was a world, a place where she had control, where no god could interfere, and where thread could be bent into meaning. She wove not just garments, but stories, tiny motifs hidden in border patterns, little rebellions threaded into tunics that nobles never noticed. It was not that she disrespected the gods. She feared them, as everyone did. But she questioned them, silently, patiently, with thread. You might wonder how a woman like that could be dangerous. But that's the thing about power. It doesn't always come from thrones. Sometimes it comes from the hands of someone who has lived long enough to stop caring about consequences. And Eudora had lived long. Her granddaughter Arachne was still a child when the first signs came. Eudora would take her outside under the olive trees and show her how the warp must always yield to the weft, how tension created beauty, how mistakes had to be accepted or cleverly hidden. But more than technique, Eudora passed down questions. "What makes Athena better than us?" she once muttered when they were alone. "Did she learn weaving? Or did she take it from someone less powerful?" Such thoughts were dangerous. But children remember. Arachne did. The villagers respected Eudora's skill, but whispered about her solitude. She rarely went to temple. She gave offerings only when pressed. Some said she had seen Athena once, many, years ago, in a dream, and had woken up laughing. Others claimed she'd been punished before and simply endured it in silence. One winter, when food was scarce and tempers short, Eudora sold a cloak that bore the likeness of Artemis hunting, except the arrows bent backward. A minor merchant noticed it and brought it to the temple in jest. The priest didn't laugh. By spring, word had reached the capital, not of a rebellion, not of a battle, but of an old woman who dared to suggest, in stitches and wool, that the gods might not be perfect. It wasn't blasphemy, not exactly, but it was discomforting, and discomfort, in the world of gods, was often enough. So one day, a figure came to the village, not a goddess, not a warrior, but a man dressed in crisp robes, bearing Athena's seal, with a scroll in one hand and a polite threat in the other. He requested Eudora's presence in a small hearing, a discussion of civic integrity. It wasn't a trial, not officially, but everyone knew what it was. She was to appear before temple officials in the city of Halinoros to answer questions about her patterned commentary. Neighbors came in hushed tones. "Just apologize," one said. "Tell them your hands were cold, your mind tired." But Eudora only nodded. That night, she burned half her yarn, not out of fear, but to make sure no one else would be caught with her cloth. She travelled alone. No family. Not even Arachne. Just a basket of plain cloth and a spindle tucked into her cloak. The hearing hall was modest. No marble columns, no glares from statues, but it held a dozen men with tidy beards and ink-stained fingers, and one silent woman with a temple robe and no expression. They did not yell. They asked, gently, softly, like prodding a wound. "Do you believe Athena gifted weaving to mortals? Did your designs imply divine failure? Why did you never offer prayers at the shrine?" Eudora answered in measured tones. She spoke of thread, of errors, of the freedom to create. "If I must imagine the gods in my work," she said, "can I not imagine them imperfect? Does thread lie if it tells an honest question?" There was no verdict that day, only silence. And when she returned, weeks later, the village was colder. Fewer greeted her. Some merchants stopped coming. Her house felt smaller. But something else happened too. Arachne, now a young girl, began to watch her loom more carefully. She began asking questions with her eyes, not her words. And slowly, Eudora began teaching her not just how to weave, but how to think, because Eudora understood something the temple didn't. The gods might strike you for your defiance, but they could not unlearn your questions once you'd asked them. And in that silence, in that thread, something began to unravel. Whispers on the lumen. The seasons that followed her hearing, Eudora remained outwardly unchanged, rising at dawn, tending to her small garden, and weaving in the same rhythm that had once built her survival. But to those paying attention, something had shifted, not in her hands or her face, but in her silence. There's a kind of hush that follows a warning. Not fear exactly, but awareness. The kind that hangs heavy in the air like smoke after a fire that didn't spread, but could have. Her neighbours still nodded, still bought her plainer cloth, but they avoided her door. Not out of spite, out of unease. The temple had not punished her officially, but its message had been heard. Be careful where your patterns lead. And so, the village tucked its head lower, prayed more loudly, and avoided weaving stories into their cloth. But Arachne, sharp-eyed and growing, did not forget. At 11, her fingers moved faster than her grandmother's. At 12, she could copy any design by sight. and by 13, she was experimenting with patterns of her own. Not bold ones, not yet, but curious ones. She had heard what had happened in Halinoros. She knew about the questions, and more importantly, the silences in response. One night, as they sat by the hearth, the light from the coals flickering across their faces, Arachne asked quietly, "Did they frighten you?" Eudora didn't answer at first. She simply kept spinning, her foot moving the wheel like clockwork. Then she said, "No, but they wanted to." That was the point. Arachne looked at her own unfinished cloth. "What would happen if I wove a god with a cracked crown?" Eudora's eyes didn't flinch. "Depends who sees it." That was her way. Eudora did not say yes or no. She led you to the edge of the river and let you decide if you'd cross it. But the world, as always, was changing. Sardis was growing. Merchants brought not only goods, but stories from the west, of temples collapsing in minor earthquakes, of priests arguing with kings, of oracles refusing to speak for days. Whispers passed among the older women that perhaps the gods were angry. Others said they were simply retreating. One morning, Eudora awoke to find her door painted, a red streak smeared with haste. Not an official mark, but not random either. A warning or a plea, maybe both. She scrubbed it clean without a word, but her fingers trembled for the first time in years. Later that week, a cloth merchant from Lydia arrived and requested custom work, a tapestry to honor Athena's glory. He brought gold thread, fine wool, and specific instructions. Athena must appear triumphant, beautiful, above all, flawless. Her eyes must be stern but merciful. Her hands must be lifted in power. The scene would depict her victory over Poseidon, the moment she offered the olive tree and claimed Athens. Eudora listened carefully, nodding politely. When he left, she turned to Arachne and said, "You'll do this one." The girl blinked. "Me?" Eudora smiled. "You know the story, but why me?" "Because your hands are ready, and your mind is dangerous. Time they met." Arachne worked for weeks. She followed the brief, perfectly, on the surface. But within the folds of colour and light, she left traces. Athena's robe bore a faint crack, just under the hem. The olive tree, if you looked closely, twisted in a strange direction, not toward the heavens, but away. In the background, a single figure, a woman with a loom, stood watching the gods, invisible to most eyes. The merchant paid her double. Eudora said nothing. But one night, she touched Arachne's cheek and whispered, "Never forget what they're afraid of. It isn't your talent, it's your truth." Soon, word of Arachne's skill began to spread. She was invited to competitions, offered silk from Corinth, dyed thread from Ephesus. With every cloth she wove, her fingers told deeper stories, and though they were technically perfect, there was always a feeling beneath the surface. Something unspoken, something dangerous. Priests began visiting again, kindly, curious. "You are so young," they would say. "Such talent should be honored, perhaps in service to the gods." But the question always came with a shadow, an expectation. Eudora saw it, and she knew what it meant. One evening, as autumn fell hard over Sardis and the cold crept through their windows, Eudora took down her oldest tapestry. It was faded, dusty, and small. Not her best work, but its pattern, a winding river beneath, a sun with too many rays, was the first piece she ever questioned the gods in. She laid it on Arachne's lap. "This," she said, "was my rebellion." No one ever noticed it. Arachne touched the threads, now brittle with age. "They will notice you," Eudora said quietly, "and they will try to own you, praise you, flatter you, and if that fails, threaten you." Arachne's brow furrowed. "Then what should I do?" Eudora looked at her, not with fear, but with the strange calm of someone who had outlived punishment. "Whatever you do, make sure your thread tells the truth, even if no one sees it." 2 weeks later, Eudora fell ill. A quiet cough turned into fever. She did not cry out. She did not ask for help. And she did not say goodbye in any grand way. On the last day, Arachne sat beside her, holding her hand. The old woman looked out the window, where olive leaves shimmered in the dying light. Then she whispered, "Don't waste your time pleasing shadows." And with that, she was gone. Arachne buried her quietly. No priest, no offerings, just a spool of thread placed in her hand. But what followed was not mourning. It was clarity. Arachne took up the loom not as a craft, but as a challenge. And what came next would echo through myth, not because it was loud, but because it was precise. The gods had been warned, and the warning had come not from a hero or a king, but from an old woman with wool in her fingers. The pattern that broke. Olympus, the death of Eudora, did not silence her voice. It sharpened. Her absence left a space, and Arachne filled it not with tears, but with thread. Sardis changed too, quietly. The villagers who once whispered around Eudora's door now watched Arachne with caution and awe. Her tapestries were no longer simple commissions, they were spectacles. Even the temple priests bought them, admiring the symmetry, the brilliance, the devotion. They didn't always notice the cracks beneath the patterns, but some did. One spring morning, a stranger arrived at Arachne's home. She wore a cloak of pale green, too fine for a traveller. Her posture was too rigid, her voice too smooth. "I've heard of your talent," she said, "and of your grandmother." Arachne nodded slowly. "Many have. I wonder," the woman said, brushing a hand across a finished tapestry, "if you would be willing to enter a public contest. A weaving of praise, a depiction of the gods at their most glorious, an offering of humility." Arachne paused. Her hand tightened on the loom. Humility for whom? The woman smiled, but her eyes did not. "For you, of course." The next day, a town crier announced it, a public contest sponsored by the Temple of Athena. Any artisan could enter, but only one name drew the crowd: Arachne. By now she was known far beyond Sardis. Merchants from Delos, priests from Delphi, even scholars from Athens came to see the girl who weaved with the precision of divinity and the spirit of defiance. The day of the contest was unusually still. No wind, no birdsong, just the sound of looms being assembled in the square. Arachne wore no jewelry, no bright robe. She came with thread, needle, and quiet fury. Across from her, the cloaked woman stood again, this time in full view of the crowd. Her form shimmered briefly, and gasps broke the silence. It was Athena. The goddess stood in her radiant armor, her spear resting beside her like a staff of law. "Let the contest begin," she declared, her voice echoing with unnatural clarity. And so, they wove. Athena's hands moved with divine rhythm. She created a tapestry of Olympus, each god rendered in gold, sitting upon marble thrones. She depicted her triumph over Poseidon, the birth of wisdom from Zeus's skull, the order and majesty of the heavens. Her work was flawless, no stitch out of place. Arachne's loom was silent by contrast. Her face gave nothing away, but her eyes burned. When the cloth was finally unfurled, a wave of murmurs passed through the crowd. Then silence. Arachne's tapestry was no less perfect, but far less flattering. She had woven the gods in their failures, Zeus seducing mortals under false shapes, Poseidon flooding villages in rage, Apollo ignoring prayers, Athena herself punishing a mortal girl for being curious, and there, in the center, an old woman weaving under a cracked ceiling, her eyes watching gods from afar. It was beautiful. It was brutal. It was true. For a moment, Athena said nothing. Her eyes swept the tapestry once, then again. Her jaw clenched. "You mock the gods?" she said softly. Arachne's voice was steady. "No, I show them. As they are." The crowd held its breath. Athena stepped forward. Her fingers grazed the edge of the tapestry. "This is flawless," she said. "And for that reason, it is dangerous." Arachne stood her ground. "My grandmother taught me that truth is not dangerous. Only those who fear it are." And with that, something ancient cracked. Not in the sky, not in the earth, but in the old agreement between gods and mortals. The idea that divinity was not to be questioned, not to be measured. Athena's face did not twist in rage. She did not summon lightning or fire. Instead, she reached out, slowly, and placed her hand on Arachne's shoulder. "You are bold," she said, "and boldness comes with cost." In that instant, Arachne's body changed. Her hands shrank, her fingers elongated, her back curled, her limbs twisted, and she fell to the ground in pain. When she stood again, she was no longer a girl, but a creature. Her fingers now legs, her body covered in soft hairs, her loom now a web, a spider. The crowd recoiled in horror. Some ran, others watched, frozen, but Athena did not gloat. Her eyes were distant, not victorious, but unsettled. She turned to the crowd. "Let it be known," she said, "that no flaw in craft will ever be punished, but pride must be balanced." Then she vanished. Arachne, or what was left of her, crawled away slowly. But even now, the wind carried a thread of her final words. "If pride is truth, then let me be proud forever." In the years that followed, the myth of Arachne was told in temples, markets, schools. But few spoke of Eudora, of the woman who taught questions, not obedience, who showed that resistance could come in silence, not war, and that the first thread that unraveled Olympus was not shouted, but whispered. You may think myths are about gods and monsters, but often they're about old women with looms, about daughters who watch, about questions no one wants to hear. And in those questions, history is made. Hermes and the boring cattle records. He had to forge the ledger beneath the sandals. Long before Hermes became known as the fleet-footed god of messages, mischief and commerce, before he was praised in marble halls and inscribed in ancient hymns, he was a clerk. Yes, you heard right. Not a thief, not a trickster, but a clerk. A keeper of cattle records, bound not by chains but by scrolls. And that, perhaps, is the most overlooked, and ironically, the most formative chapter of his myth. you probably know the story they teach first. Hermes, just a baby, sneaks out of his cradle, steals Apollo's cattle, and invents the lyre out of a tortoise shell. It's playful, impressive, and full of divine charm. But what they don't tell you is what happened after he returned the cattle. There was a problem. You see, even gods, with their ego and immortality, have rules, bureaucratic ones. And Apollo, being the god of order and prophecy, insisted that if Hermes was to keep his place on Olympus after his trick, he would need to make it right with paperwork. And so, as absurd as it may seem, Hermes was handed a quill, a scroll, and a title, overseer of divine livestock and sacred exchanges. This was not a glamorous role. His job? To record every divine animal under the protection of Olympus. Herds of Apollo, sacred swans of Artemis, Dionysus's wine-drunk donkeys, all had to be accounted for. Weight, health, movements, reproductions, even waste disposal, if you can believe it. He was, in essence, Olympus's first bureaucrat. Hermes was 17 by immortal standards and burning with speed and ambition. He wasn't built for sitting still, yet here he was, tucked into a temple side room, surrounded by parchment, quills, and a suspiciously uncooperative goat named Bletch. Every movement must be recorded, said Apollo, handing him a fresh scroll. The gods are watching. Hermes, of course, smirked. Let them. I've got excellent handwriting. But handwriting wasn't the problem. The problem was that the divine herds moved constantly across temples, terrains, and timelines. And no one, not even the gods themselves, wanted to maintain accuracy. Artemis wouldn't let male scribes into her forests. Dionysus would forget where he left half his animals after a celebration. Hades. He didn't even believe in registering Cerberus. So Hermes, ever the improviser, began to forge. Not out of malice, but necessity. He created patterns. He estimated. He invented classification codes for divine hooves. He began signing off records with verified by eternal observation, which sounded important enough to avoid follow-up questions. When temple inspectors arrived, he'd charm them with data visualizations using pebbles and wine. And somehow, it worked. His records were pristine, consistent, almost too perfect. That, of course, drew suspicion. One afternoon, Hera herself requested a review of the archives. She'd heard rumors that Hermes had simplified the scrolls detailing her sacred peacocks. A mistake in divine inventory, she said, could unravel balance. Hermes prepared. He spent the night reweaving 3 months of falsified data into a new scroll, more believable, with margin notes in fake priest handwriting and stamped with "Witnessed by Delphi." He even burned a bit of parchment to make it look older. When Hera arrived with her entourage of scribes, Hermes bowed, offered her pomegranate wine, and unrolled the scroll with theatrical grace. She read it slowly, narrowed her eyes, then said, "Nothing." The scroll passed inspection, but Hermes knew. The gods weren't fooled. They were amused, because this too was balance. Trickery and order. Chaos managed with charm. And it was here, in this dull, dusty corner of Olympus, where Hermes sharpened the skill that would define him. Not stealing cattle, but forging trust. Manipulating structure without breaking it. It is ironic, isn't it, that the god of speed learned patience from paperwork, that the master of deception learned how to lie so well it became truth, and that the stories no one sings about, The boring ledgers, the fake hoofprints, the bureaucratic negotiations with temple guards were the very things that made him indispensable. This is the part of mythology that rarely makes the cut, because it isn't exciting, but it's real, and it's the kind of story you understand more the older you get. When you realize that even gods have to file reports, and that power often hides behind the quiet rustle of scrolls. The scrolls, that whispered truth. If you walked into the stone archives beneath the Temple of Apollo at Delos during the 3rd century BCE, you'd likely see hundreds of scrolls arranged in baffling categories: sacred livestock, celestial, offerings, not consumed, animal disputes, minor, and so on. And deep within, if you knew exactly where to look, you might find an aging scroll sealed with a faint silver thread and marked with a strange sigil, a winged sandal crossing a quill. That was one of Hermes's original forgeries. And here's the stranger part. It wasn't a record of animals. It was a manual, not written for gods, not for priests, but for someone like you, or someone like the young apprentice scribes Hermes saw in the temple corridors, burdened with rules they didn't write. The manual was written in riddles, couched in bureaucratic language, but its message was clear. Don't worship the system. Learn how to walk through it sideways. But let's step back. After Hera's review, Hermes's position was elevated. Not officially, of course, but unofficially, the gods began calling on him for discreet record-keeping. Not lies. Not exactly. But adjustments, a parchment here, a date there. Apollo once asked him to edit the lunar calendar to match the aesthetic of prophecy. Ares demanded battle casualty reports that excluded dishonorable wounds. Even Demeter requested softer wording in the reports about failed harvest rites. And Hermes delivered. Because by now he had perfected the art of divine editing, but it wore on him. He began to wonder what would happen if he simply stopped. What if he reported the truth as it was, messy, incomplete, boring? What if he let the gods see their inefficiencies? So one spring, he did just that. He submitted a quarterly report detailing real events. Sacred bulls missing for months, overfed temple swans refusing to fly, a sheep that had been blessed 3 times by mistake, and a widespread outbreak of fungal hoof rot among Artemis's stags. The report was brilliant, honest, accurate, and completely rejected. Apollo returned it with a single note: rewrite, remove unnecessary chaos. Hermes didn't argue, but he understood something that day. Something Eudora might have whispered, had she been born a god. The truth is only dangerous when it's boring and can't be ignored, and Hermes had made it boring. That was the threat. The scroll wasn't burned. It wasn't banned. It was filed, quietly, deep in the archives, where truth goes to nap. So Hermes adapted again. He began hiding truth inside beauty. He recorded divine taxations as poetry, transcribed sacrificial inventories as riddles, and inside those riddles, he tucked contradictions. If Athena received 4 oxen and Hades sent 3 back for divine auditing, but no scroll shows either transit, what remains? The answer, of course, was power, because whoever controlled the scrolls controlled the memory, and the gods, for all their thunder, hated forgetting more than they feared being wrong. There's a reason Hermes became the god of communication. It wasn't just about messages. It was about managing the space between silence and chaos, about knowing what to say when, and more importantly, what not to write down. It was around this time that rumors began circulating in Delphi, about scrolls that changed ink overnight. about temple ledgers that reversed their entries after moonrise, about apprentices who swore they copied one thing, only to return and find another. The priests blamed ghosts or prophecies, but some whispered the truth. Hermes had begun training others, not in secret societies, but through breadcrumbs, marginal notes in sacred ledgers, oddly phrased taxonomies, even graffiti behind temple doors that read, "The goat is never just a goat." This was his rebellion, not loud, not even public, just a slow erosion of divine certainty, a reminder that bureaucracy was not neutral, it was interpretation in disguise, and still, he delivered the records, on time, immaculate, revered, because the gods liked a little mystery, as long as it didn't threaten them directly. But one day, it did. The spark was small. A young temple clerk in Mycenae noticed a discrepancy in Artemis's wild game ledger. According to the scroll, a stag had been sacrificed on the winter solstice, but the stars showed it was a full moon. That couldn't be, not for a sacred animal. He reported it. The priest dismissed it. So the boy investigated further. He began comparing scrolls, timelines, even seeking out shepherds and hunters. His curiosity spread. A handful of scribes across different cities started finding gaps. Names missing, days rearranged, sacrifices doubled. Something wasn't adding up. Eventually, their findings reached Mount Olympus. Athena summoned Hermes. "You've been clever," she said. Hermes tilted his head. "Is that a compliment or a charge?" "Both," she replied. "The mortals are asking too many questions." He smiled faintly. "Maybe it's time they did." She studied him. "You know we could erase the scrolls, the ledgers, even their memories." "I know," he said, "but the truth won't go away. It just finds another ledger." Athena's eyes narrowed. "And if the truth undermines the gods?" Hermes folded his arms. "Then maybe the gods need better systems." Silence. And then, to his surprise, Athena didn't strike him, didn't demote him. She simply walked away. Because in truth, even, she had used his ledgers, forged or not, to maintain her image. The gods needed the scrolls, and they needed him. That is how Hermes became irreplaceable. Not because he obeyed, but because he understood that even divine order relies on fiction, dressed in fact. And sometimes, fiction is more stable than the truth. So next time you hear thunder, or offer wine at a crossroads, or write something in pencil you'll later erase, remember this. Hermes is not just the god of messages, he is the keeper of contradictions. And he wrote the truth sideways, so it could survive the gods. The divine audit that never happened. If you stand at the edge of the ruins in Delos and press your hand to the stone wall behind the old livestock enclosure, the one everyone mistakes for a storage barn, you might feel a faint groove worn by time, a mark shaped like a feathered sandal. Few visitors notice it, even fewer understand its meaning. But in the age when God still walked among us, this was the symbol of an unspoken truth. Hermes had outlived his own lies. Let's return to the last scroll. It wasn't made of papyrus, but of fine goat parchment soaked in honey ash and sealed in volcanic resin. Hermes wrote it by starlight, not in the temple scriptorium, but in a quiet cave in Arcadia, the place of his birth. It wasn't a record, it wasn't a manual, it was a confession, but not of guilt, of mastery. You see, after years of manipulating the divine record-keeping system, Hermes wasn't interested in deceit anymore. He was interested in legacy, and not the grand kind, not shrines or poems or altars. He wanted something quieter. a system that worked without being noticed. And that's what he built. You may think gods don't care for bureaucracy, but that's only because we inherit their cleaned-up myths. The reality, every act of worship, every sacrifice, every hymn, they all needed a ledger. Someone had to keep track of what was offered, what was owed, what was due. Olympus, for all its immortality, was built on administration, and Hermes ran that machine from the shadows. He created redundancies, secret cross-checks in temple archives, rituals that encoded record-keeping into the ceremony itself. For instance, when a bull was sacrificed, the smoke had to drift left, not for aesthetic reasons, but because it signaled confirmation to a priest standing at the western pillar, who then recited a verse that doubled as a mnemonic for herd count. Hermes made worship into mathematics, but invisible mathematics, and that's where it got dangerous. Because in time, the gods became dependent on his structures. They forgot how to verify their own myths. Apollo's oracles began quoting scrolls Hermes had adjusted decades prior. Hera's temple priests couldn't recite lineage hymns unless they used Hermes's annotated scrolls. Even Zeus, thunderous, proud, untouchable Zeus, once delayed judgment on a mortal dispute until Hermes sent the right document. That was the point. The divine system had been rethreaded, not destroyed, not corrupted, but redesigned, quietly, boringly. Which is why, when the idea of a divine audit was raised, there was panic. It began with a mortal senator from Thessaly, a reformer type, curious about the financial disparities between temples. He petitioned Olympus through the oracle of Dodona, asking for a formal review of divine transactions. He had no idea what he was asking. The gods debated. Some scoffed. Ares was furious. Demeter was anxious. Hestia abstained. But Athena insisted it would show strength. That transparency would quiet mortal restlessness. Only Hermes knew the truth. If the audit went forward, nothing would match. Not because of mistakes, because of intention. He had invented systems within systems, falsified ledgers to balance divine egos, corrected offering reports to preserve mortal belief, altered sacrificial records to match weather patterns. It wasn't fraud. It was myth management, and now it threatened to collapse. He visited Apollo first. "If they dig too deep," Hermes said, "they'll find that your prophecies shifted after I adjusted the lunar alignment scrolls." Apollo raised an eyebrow. "You mean I've been quoting forged moons?" "Accurate for the audience," Hermes replied, "which is what mattered." Then he went to Athena. "You'll find some of your wisdom scrolls dated 2 centuries, before the events they describe." "Impossible," she snapped. "Unless you wanted the perception of foresight," Hermes said. "Which you did." Even Zeus, when approached, was silent. He knew. He always had. But even he didn't want. The scrolls reopened. So the audit was cancelled. No thunder, no explanation. The mortal senator fell mysteriously ill and died weeks later. His scrolls disappeared. His proposals were never copied. Some said he was cursed. Others said the gods struck him down. But Hermes? He never touched the man. He simply let the system erase him. Because that's the final lesson Hermes learned. Not from Olympus, but from mortals. Truth can be more fragile than a lie if it doesn't fit the structure built to hold it. So he wrote that last scroll. Not for the gods, not even for scribes, but for whoever would inherit his burden. It ended like this. I did not invent lies. I invented clarity, too sharp to look at directly. I did not betray the gods. I preserved them, in spreadsheets and side glances, You may think me a trickster, but I only rearranged the pieces to protect the game. That scroll was never found, not officially. But temple archivists over the centuries have reported strange discoveries. Marginal notes in languages that no longer exist, symbols appearing on inventory scrolls that defy translation, and ledgers that seem to rewrite themselves in mirror light. Some say it's divine error, but others say it's Hermes, still watching, still balancing the books behind the veil. Because long after the gods grew quiet, long after the temples crumbled and belief turned to history, one truth remained. Power survives not through force, but through the quiet management of what gets written down. And Hermes, he wrote everything down, just not where anyone expected. The olive tree taxation scandal during Athena's rain branches of bureaucracy. When we think of Athena, the goddess of wisdom, strategy, and cities, we imagine her with spear in hand, eyes like polished marble, and judgment as crisp as a sharpened blade. She was logic incarnate, discipline woven into divine form. And yet, even Athena had her messes. One of the strangest and most quietly catastrophic was over olive trees. Yes, olive trees, not wars, not monsters, but taxes on branches. To understand how this came about, we must return to Athens in its golden infancy. The city was hers, gifted and claimed through that famous contest with Poseidon. He had offered the saltwater spring. She, the olive tree. The people chose her. And so, olive trees became sacred. But when something becomes sacred, it must be measured, preserved, and, eventually, taxed. The issue wasn't the trees themselves, but what grew from them. Olives, oil, wood, and most of all, control. The groves spread fast, lining estates, crowding hilltops, and overtaking farmlands. They weren't just trees, they were symbols of favor, tokens of status. If a family had an olive grove near the Acropolis, it was whispered that Athena herself smiled upon them. Naturally, this led to questions. Who owned which trees? Who had the right to harvest? Did temple groves belong to the city or the goddess? And most critically, how much should one pay for the privilege of profiting from something divine? At first, the answer was ceremonial. A portion of the oil from every major harvest was offered to Athena's temple. A symbolic tithe, a gesture. But as Athens grew wealthier and the trade of olive oil expanded, from local amphorae to massive shipments across the Aegean, the gesture became insufficient. So the city, under the guise of devotion, created the sacred olive registry. The goal was simple: track every olive tree deemed descended from the original tree of Athena. If your grove was registered, you paid tribute not only to the goddess, but to the city. What started as 5 sacred groves became 50, then 500. Soon, inspectors were dispatched, olive auditors, tasked with measuring groves, assessing divine lineage, and collecting tributes. They carried scrolls bearing Athena's owl seal and wore modest bronze pins shaped like olive branches. But this is where the problems began. You see, the divine lineage of an olive tree is a complicated matter. There is no scroll from the gods confirming which trees are descendants. There are no holy roots glowing with wisdom. There is only rumor, legacy, and proximity. And so, corruption bloomed. Wealthy families bribed inspectors to certify their trees as sacred. Poorer farmers found their groves taxed heavily, even if they had been planted by their grandfathers with no temple ties. Some groves were declared dual-owned, half sacred, half secular. A tree could be taxed on one side of its trunk, but not the other. Disputes erupted. property lines blurred. One farmer claimed his olive tree crossed into sacred land only during strong winds. Another insisted that his oil press purified the olives, making them no longer divine and therefore not taxable. The inspectors, now referred to sarcastically as Athena's pickers, grew powerful. They were bribed, threatened, even worshipped. One particularly ambitious auditor named Thalos began wearing ceremonial robes and accepting offerings in his own name. Athena was watching. At first, she said nothing. She preferred order, after all, and perhaps she hoped the system would regulate itself, but it didn't. It fractured. Reports reached the Parthenon of forged seals, miscounted jars, and even counterfeit olive trees, saplings, transplanted in the night from common land to private groves with fabricated heritage. A scandal emerged when two temples in different regions claimed the same tree as their sacred origin. A public trial was held. Arguments were made based on root structure, harvest taste, and even dreams in which Athena supposedly appeared. Nothing was resolved. The tree mysteriously died a week later, and the city began to grumble. Faith twisted into resentment. Whispers of divine favoritism spread. Athena protects only the rich, some muttered. The gods care more for oil than honor. That's when Athena intervened, not with lightning, not with rage, but with something more terrifying, a full audit. She descended into the olive groves herself. Disguised as a mortal scribe, she moved among farmers, priests, and auditors. She asked questions. She listened. She watched who bowed too deeply, who lied too easily. And what she found, even she could not ignore. The registry had collapsed into fiction. Half the sacred trees had no documentation. The tributes collected were missing. Inspectors pocketed oil jars as pilgrimage gifts. Some had built private estates funded entirely by grove taxation. Athena returned to the Acropolis and summoned the council. "I gave you trees," she said. "You turned them into chains." And then, in a moment both profound and entirely boring, she revoked the registry. All olive groves, she declared, would return to their original stewards. Only one tree would remain sacred, the very first planted during her contest with Poseidon. All others, no matter their size or fame, would be ordinary. This caused chaos, lawsuits, grief, but also relief. And slowly, Athens recalibrated. Olive oil remained essential, but its mythology was trimmed. The groves stayed, the prophets returned, but the divine taxes, the bureaucracy that blurred, faith and greed, dissolved like olive oil in rain. This is not the myth people remember. You won't find it in epic poems or painted urns. It's too dry, too technical, too domestic. But in that dusty, bureaucratic story lies one of the rarest things in myth. A god admitting their system failed and fixing it. Not with violence, but with a pen stroke. Because sometimes the biggest miracles don't come from war or wisdom. They come from revoking the tax on an olive branch. The inspectors who knew too much. After Athena revoked the sacred olive registry, the city of Athens did not return to peace overnight. Instead, it entered a period historians would later call the olive lull. Not because things were calm, but because no one quite knew what to do with their trees anymore. Imagine it. Hundreds of groves suddenly stripped of sacred status, temple accountants in disarray, former auditors unemployed, farmers uncertain whether their next harvest would be taxed, blessed, or forgotten. And in the center of it all stood the inspectors, those quiet agents of divine bureaucracy, suddenly exposed. Some tried to reinvent themselves. Thalos, the self-proclaimed High Grove auditor, attempted to rebrand as an olive heritage consultant. He published scrolls detailing how to spiritually cleanse groves that had once been falsely registered. Others opened schools to teach proper pruning in the style of Athena's original tree, claiming divine influence still lingered in certain cutting techniques, but not everyone adapted. Many of the inspectors had grown rich, or at least comfortable, in their roles. They were accustomed to quiet power, small bribes, deference from priests. And now they had nothing but scrolls no one wanted, and ledgers no one trusted. Some burned them. Others tried to sell their secrets to estates, to merchant guilds, even to rival cities eager to learn from Athens's mistake. But a few disappeared entirely. Rumors spread that a hidden ledger still existed, an unedited master scroll cataloguing every tree that had ever been falsely certified, every bribe accepted, every jar miscounted. Not the official registry, but the shadow version, compiled by one of the inspectors who'd grown wary long before the collapse. According to whispers, it wasn't made for power. It was made as insurance, and it had one strange entry near the end. Line 3841, Grove 17B, falsely certified sacred to allow son's military exemption. Bribe, 3 jars, aged oil, Temple of Eleusis, marked by Athena in disguise. Burned scroll, memory retained. This single note, the idea that one inspector had not only spotted Athena in mortal form but recorded the moment, sparked panic. Because if that ledger existed, so did accountability, and no one, god or mortal, wanted that. A quiet hunt began. It wasn't declared. There were no formal decrees. But former auditors began visiting one another under the guise of reunion. Conversations twisted slowly to questions. Do you still have the old scrolls? Do you remember who kept the deep archive? Have you seen Phaedon lately? Phaedon, the quietest of them all. He had been an olive scribe, never an inspector, never a priest. Just a man who copied every grove document with obsessive care. While others basked in influence, Phaedon lingered in back rooms, recording changes no one noticed. Some believed he had built a secret copy of the registry, untouched by edits, and that Athena had spared him, on purpose. They were right. When a group of ex-inspectors finally found Phaedon, it was not in a library, but in a garden, a modest one, overgrown, olive trees leaning naturally, unshaped, unsold. He greeted them without fear. "I thought you might come," he said. "We want the scroll," one said. "The real one," Phaedon nodded. "I still have it." There was a silence. "Then burn it," another said. "No," he replied, "because you don't need to fear it anymore." They stared. Phaedon sat beneath the largest tree. Athena saw all of this. She chose not to punish you. She could have turned you into groves yourselves, roots and bark and silence, but she didn't. Why? Because she needed you to live with what you did. One man scoffed. "You sound like a priest." "I'm not," Phaedon said. "I'm a record keeper, and records matter, even when no one reads them." And then he did the unthinkable. He read aloud from the scroll, not to shame, not to blackmail, but to unburden. Each entry was dry, factual, plain. A date, a grove, a discrepancy, a bribe, a result. No emotion, just memory. The men sat in silence. When he finished, he did not ask forgiveness. He did not offer the scroll to the gods. He rolled it up, placed it in an urn, and buried it beneath the tree. "If anyone ever digs it up," he said, "they'll find the truth, not because they were told, but because they searched." News of Phaedon's act spread quietly. Athens began to change, not dramatically, not overnight, but in tone. Groves once flaunted became humble again. Farmers began marking their trees by year, not blessing. Trade shifted from sacred symbols to quality oils. Even temples adapted, offering simple prayers for harvests rather than tithes for prestige. The city returned, not to faith or fear, but to clarity, and Athena, she watched. She did not bless the trees anew, she did not punish the men, but she visited Phaedon's garden often, unseen, to sit beneath the tree that held the scroll no one wanted, and everyone needed. Because even a goddess of wisdom must live with systems she let break. This is why the story matters. Not because of theft or violence, but because in every empire, every temple, every place where holiness and economy meet, there comes a moment when someone says, "Wait, who wrote this down?" And the answer shapes the future. So remember Phaedon, the clerk who didn't lie, and the scroll buried under an ordinary olive tree, which someday someone just like you might find. The tree that remembered years past. The sacred olive registry faded into a cautionary tale told to apprentices learning temple lore. Inspectors became merchants, priests, or whispers in the market. And Phaedon's garden, with its plain, uncut olive trees, became a curiosity, then a story, then a legend. People began calling it the garden that listened. Not because it grew the finest olives, not because it was large or sacred or profitable, but because it held something deeper. Silence that had once been burdened with truth. Children played near the roots. Scribes occasionally visited to sketch the trees. Every now and then, a philosopher would stop and sit quietly, sensing something important had happened there, though they couldn't say what. But Phaedon never left. He aged gently in that garden, tending to the trees, teaching no one, preaching nothing. He didn't speak of the scroll buried beneath the earth. He didn't warn or threaten. He simply preserved. And that, perhaps, was his quiet defiance. To let the memory stay in the soil, rather than rot in a temple archive. Meanwhile, Athens changed. The city became less obsessed with divine classification. Olive oil continued to flow across seas, across tables, across generations. But the need to label trees as more holy than others waned. Farmers reclaimed their autonomy. The market grew more honest, though never perfect. And Athena, she never revoked her revocation. But she did, on one rare occasion, return to the garden. It was dusk. The air was thick with the scent of leaves, and Phaedon, now white-haired and slow, was trimming a low branch. He didn't turn when he heard the soft rustle behind him. "You're late," he said. Athena stood beneath the largest tree, the one under which the scroll was buried. "You never asked for reward," she said. "I was never owed one," he replied. "But you saved their names, even the ones who wronged you." Phaedon looked up. "Because forgetting doesn't cleanse anything. It just makes us repeat." Athena tilted her head. "You think they'll find it?" "Not soon," he said. "But yes, one day. Maybe when they need to." She said nothing. He returned to his trimming. Then she asked, more softly, "Do you hate me for letting it happen?" Phaedon paused. "No, but I think you forgot your own lesson." Athena narrowed her gaze. "You gave them a gift, a tree that fed, healed, and lasted. And then you let them fight over who owned it, instead of teaching them how to care for it." The goddess said nothing. because he was right. And for gods, that is the rarest kind of wound. When Phaedon died, no ceremony followed, no priests, no marble marker, just a stone placed at the base of the old olive tree. On it, no name, only an engraving of a scroll and a branch. But what followed was ceremony, just not the official kind. For decades, pilgrims came to the garden. Some to pray, some to study, some to confess, not to gods, not to statues, but to the earth, to the roots that held a record no one could read, but everyone could feel. Stories began to form. They said if you sat long enough beneath the old tree, it would whisper the name of an ancestor you'd forgotten. Or that if you buried a lie beside its roots, it would vanish, not erased, but composted. Priests quietly discouraged these tales, but the garden grew, and that tree, the one that remembered everything, never bore more fruit than it needed, never drew more attention than it deserved, but it lived through wars, through drought, through empire and fall. There is a truth hidden in every civilization, that records shape memory, and memory shapes justice. And when gods tax trees and mortals write scrolls and power disguises itself as ritual, someone must remember why it started. Not to punish, but to prevent. So the next time you walk past an olive tree, spare a thought. Not for Athena, not for law, but for the clerk with no title who wrote down what others tried to erase. Because history doesn't survive by being told. It survives when someone, somewhere, refuses to forget. Why Dionysus once declared a vineyard illegal, the wine that was too perfect. There are stories of Dionysus that are wild, as they should be. He was the god of wine, madness, theatre, and ecstatic joy. He made ivy grow in winter and turned rivers into wine. He loved chaos, defied order, and welcomed mortals and misfits into his fold. But once, just once, Dionysus shut a vineyard down, not for being corrupt, not for being cursed, but because it was too perfect. This happened in the hills near Nemea, in a quiet village that rarely drew divine attention. The people there weren't known for drama or invention. They worked, prayed, harvested, simple things, but they had one pride: their wine. It came from a vineyard called Irenaeus Grove, named after an old healer who once used the grape skins to soothe fevers. The soil was rich, the seasons kind, and the wine remarkable. Not because it was sweet or powerful, but because it never changed. Every year, the yield was identical. Every jar aged the same way. Every batch, every amphora, flawless, predictable, unfailing. At first, this was a marvel. Merchants lined up for it. Temples requested it for ritual use. Even oracles, usually partial to Apollo, praised it for calming the vision haze. The village flourished. But over time, something strange happened. Celebrations became quieter. Festivals, more restrained. People drank, but did not sing. Danced, but did not stumble. The wine soothed, but it never surprised. It dulled the edge without awakening the fire. It brought peace, but not joy. And in a world where Dionysus reigned, that was a problem. The first sign of divine concern came quietly. Ivy stopped growing near the vineyard. Not dead, just absent. Then, one night, the temple's altar wine turned to water. The priest, a devoted celebrant of Dionysus for over 30 years, collapsed mid-prayer, not in agony, but in sleep. And that's when they knew. Dionysus was watching. The villagers tried to respond. They increased their offerings. They held a night-long festival. They even imported wild boar sausage from Thebes to honor his tastes. But it didn't work, because Dionysus wasn't angry. He was bored, and that, in his realm, was far more dangerous. One evening, a traveler arrived, barefoot, cloaked, with the scent of crushed grapes and forest mist. He said nothing. He simply walked through the vineyard, touching the vines, and they shuddered. The next morning, every grape had withered. No disease, no drought, just stillness. The villagers wept. Some protested. But deep down, they understood. The god had made his decision. And then at sunrise he spoke. Through the flame at the temple's altar. You gave me control without surrender. That is not worship. That is symmetry. And I did not come to tame you. I came to free you. He declared the vineyard illegal, not by mortal law, but by divine decree. No wine could be made there again under his name. The land would still grow, but not for festivals, not for rites. The balance had tipped. Perfection had insulted passion. And so, the village fell into mourning. That's where most stories would end, but not this one. Because something else happened in the shadow of that decree. Something quieter, stranger. A young girl named Thessa, apprentice to the village winemaker, began planting wild grape seeds at the edge of the grove, not in neat rows, not in even soil, just scattered, where birds dropped pits, where rabbits dug. She used no tools, she measured nothing. She sang while planting, but badly, off-key, joyfully. The elders scolded her, but the vines grew, crooked, uneven, wild, and the grapes they bore, sour one year, glorious the next, impossible to predict. They made wine that foamed unexpectedly, wine that made old men weep, and young women dance for hours without music, wine that made you feel, without reason or rhythm. And one night, Ivy returned to the grove, just one curl, across a cracked stone, beneath the moon. This is why Dionysus once banned a vineyard, not out of cruelty, but to remind mortals that wine is not just for ceremony, it is for chaos, for awakening, for the sacred art of letting go. Because perfection, repeated too often, becomes a prison, and no god of madness can bless a cage, even one made of grapes. The apprentice who refused. Balanced Thessa never meant to challenge the gods. She wasn't a priestess, a rebel, or even particularly devout. She was just curious, and perhaps a little reckless. Raised among the tidy rows of Irenaeus Grove, she had spent her childhood watching barrels filled with flawless wine, neighbors speaking in even tones, and festivals that ended right on time. There was no shouting, no broken vases, no wandering musicians stumbling home at sunrise. There was order. And even as a girl, Thessa found that strange. She didn't understand how people could drink and stay unchanged, how joy could be measured, bottled, and sold with a stamped seal. She asked questions, too many. She once poured a cup of wine into the roots of an olive tree to see if it would laugh. Her mentor, Master Solon, the vineyard's last official, winemaker, tolerated her because she worked hard. But as Dionysus's decree spread through the land, even Solon lost his taste for the craft. His hands shook when he trimmed the vines. He stopped humming while stirring the fermenting vats. "It's done," he said one morning, gazing over the rows of silent grapes. "The joy has gone." But Thessa didn't see it that way. She saw freedom. No more perfection. No more rules. No more customers demanding consistency. Dionysus had stripped them of expectation, and where others saw punishment, Thessa saw possibility. She began collecting stray vines, wild ones, grown on slopes no one tended, grapes with unfamiliar skins, some red, some green, some almost black. She mixed them. She let them rot too long, then pressed them anyway. She stirred with a branch instead of a ladle. She left one batch outside during a thunderstorm just to see what the sky would do. The first wine she made tasted like burnt fruit and pepper. The second, like rainwater and regret. But the third, it made her cry. Not from sadness or joy, but from something she couldn't name. That was the moment she understood. Wine was never meant to be perfect. It was meant to feel. Word of Thessa's experiments began to spread, slowly, like the scent of crushed thyme on a hot day. Not through priests or merchants, but through wanderers, bards, bakers. The kind of people who listened for stories that didn't yet have endings. They came quietly. They brought broken jugs and hopeful eyes. Thessa never sold her wine. She gave it in exchange for poems or laughter or silence. Whatever felt right. People began to gather at the edge of the old vineyard, not in rows, but in circles. They danced barefoot, sang out of tune, told stories that wandered off mid-thought. Some stayed for a night, others never left. The old villagers disapproved. "This isn't winemaking," they said. "It's nonsense." But the nonsense grew. One morning, Master Solon stood at the edge of Thessa's vines. He said nothing for a long time. Then he asked, "Do you think this is what Dionysus wanted?" Thessa looked at the sky. "I don't think he wants," she said. "I think he waits." Solon frowned. "For what?" "For us to stop pretending we know what joy looks like." Around this time, a new phenomenon emerged in the region. Wines began changing, spontaneously. Not just Thessa's, but in distant towns. A jar aged for 10 years would suddenly ferment overnight. A sacred amphora in Delphi sprouted a vine through its lid. In one temple, the altar wine turned blue. Priests blamed climate. Merchants blamed barrels. But the wise? They said Dionysus was listening and reacting. Because Thessa, in her wild crafting, had reminded the god that joy must evolve. That even divinity becomes brittle if it tries too hard to preserve itself. Then came the envoy, a single priest of Dionysus, draped in ivy, crowned with worn grape leaves, arrived in the village. He made no proclamations. He walked past the old vineyard, past the empty barrels of Irenaeus Grove. He went straight to Thessa's vines. She offered him a cup. He drank, then laughed, loudly, messily, with wine spilling down his chin. "You've done it wrong," he said. "I know," Thessa replied. "Good," he said, and walked away. The next day, ivy crept across the temple steps again, just a little, a whisper of green. No divine decree was reversed. Irenaeus Grove remained illegal, but no one enforced it. Because Dionysus had moved on, not in anger, but in approval of the unexpected. The perfect vineyard was never restored, but joy returned. Wild, unpredictable, deeply human. And Thessa kept planting. Some years the wine was terrible, others life-changing, but always it was alive. This is the lesson no hymn sings, that a god once banned a vineyard not because it failed him, but because it stopped trying to surprise him, and one girl, with dirt under her nails and no plan at all, brought joy back not by offering control, but by releasing it. Because the oldest truth of wine, and perhaps of life, is this. You don't bless what's perfect. You bless what makes you feel. Why Dionysus once declared a vineyard illegal, the festival without a name. There was no official name for the festival that began in Thessa's grove. It wasn't marked on any temple calendar. It had no sponsors, no priests, no scripted hymns. It wasn't annual, seasonal, or even consistent. It simply happened. Some years, it came when the first wild grapes ripened. Other times, after the first snowfall. Sometimes it rained the whole night and no one left. Sometimes it was silent. People gathering without speaking, just sitting under the vines and sipping from shared bowls. And yet, it became the most important ritual in the region. They called it the festival without a name, not out of mystery, but because it refused definition. That was the point. It began each time with someone, anyone, standing and saying something true. Not wise, not impressive, just true. A fear, a memory, a confession. I don't know how to love my brother. I miss my mother's bread. I'm afraid of turning into my father. Then came the wine. Thessa never chose who poured first. She let the bottle pass like a breeze. Sometimes it went untouched for hours. Other times, it circled a dozen hands before returning, empty, blessed, weeping. And once it began, joy followed. Not loud, not forced, but raw. Laughter that cracked. Dancing that stumbled. Songs half remembered and twice rewritten on the spot. People brought instruments they didn't know how to play. One year, someone brought a clay pot and simply tapped it for 4 hours. No one asked them to stop. No one ever asked anyone to stop. By the 5th year, the grove had changed. New vines had wrapped around the old olive trees. Flowers bloomed that no one had planted. The grapes had grown unruly, bursting through fences, creeping across stones, coiling into the shape of old memories. One vine, the locals said, twisted in the shape of a laughing face. No one trimmed it. No one dared. And Dionysus, he returned. Not in the form of thunder or flame, not even as a man. He came as a sensation, a sudden warmth in the spine, a shiver of wind that smelled like crushed thyme and laughter, a sound deep in the earth, like a heartbeat. The people didn't kneel, they didn't chant, they toasted to the wild, to the wrong, to the sacred mess of being alive. And the god, invisible but immense, answered not with words, but with ivy. It bloomed across Thessa's hut in one night, wrapped around the door, across the roof, through her storage jars. But it never choked. It held, as if to say, I see you. Not long after, a scholar from Corinth visited the grove. He was young, precise, and carried a leather-bound journal in which he recorded sacred rituals. He had heard of Thessa's gatherings and wanted to catalogue the liturgy. He asked questions, took measurements, drew diagrams of vine placement, and noted the patterns of wine fermentation. Then he tried to assign it a name. Thessa, now in her middle years, looked up from her work. Why name it? She asked. To preserve it, he said. If it's not written down, it could be lost. She smiled. It's not meant to be kept. It's meant to be found. He frowned. But what if it disappears? Thessa handed him a bottle of her most unpredictable blend, a wine that turned bitter in sunlight and sweet in darkness. It won't, she said. Not as long as someone needs it. The scholar drank, and stayed 3 years. Eventually, stories of the illegal vineyard that birthed a new ritual spread far beyond Nemea. Other villages copied the format. Imperfectly, beautifully, they held unnamed festivals in fields, ruins, dry riverbeds. Sometimes it was wine, sometimes bread, sometimes silence. But always, always, it began with someone saying something true, and never the same truth twice. Even the temples softened. The priests of Dionysus, once stern about rites and vines, began attending, not as authorities, but as participants. One priest came every year and played a broken lyre that made no music. He said it helped him hear things more clearly. No, one questioned it. And as for Irenaeus Grove, it remained untouched. The vines never regrew. The barrels stayed dry. The land itself seemed content in its silence. A monument not of punishment, but of closure. And every now and then, someone left a cup of wild wine at its edge. Not as an offering, but as a thank you. Because even punishment can lead to liberation, when it reminds us what matters. So, if you ever find yourself near an overgrown hill, where the wind smells like time and sorrow and laughter, listen carefully. If the vines move without breeze, if the earth hums beneath your feet, if a stranger hands you a cup and says, "Tell me something true," don't ask the name of the festival, just drink and speak, because that is worship, that is the ritual, that is what Dionysus, god of wine, of madness, of joy unmeasured, came for, the mud brick temple to Poseidon, that nobody prayed, in salt without. Waves. There is a temple to Poseidon near the edge of the Saronic Gulf, built not of marble or granite, but of sun-baked mud brick, weathered wood and limestone dust. No travelers visit it. No bards sing of it. Most maps don't mark it. And perhaps most strangely of all, no one ever prayed there. Not once. Not a whisper. It is one of the oldest surviving temples in the region. Older than the ones at Cape, Sunion or Isthmia. Built during a time when Poseidon was less a deity of sea storms and more a looming force that could swallow entire coastlines if displeased. The people of the village of Thalassion, who constructed it, understood this well. The village itself sat oddly far from the shore, nearly 4 miles inland, yet the sea still shaped its daily life. Salt crusted the edges of their wells. Fish bones turned up in fields nowhere near water. Every year during high tide, a low fog would roll in and linger for days, dampening the earth, rusting the tools, and curling the hair of everyone living there. And so they built a temple. Out of fear, not faith, they made it hastily, with mud, from the flood season, and stones pried from old sheep walls. There were no statues, no columns, no intricate carvings, just a square room with a hollow in the centre, meant to hold seawater fetched from the coast and poured in on the new moon. They called it the Still House, because the water inside was never to be stirred. But even as they built it, something felt off. There was no ceremony, no offerings, no hymns. The villagers gathered at a distance, watched the priest pour the first bowl of seawater into the central basin, and then left. And that's how it remained. Once a month, someone, often a young boy chosen by lot, would walk to the shore, fill a bowl with seawater, and return in silence. He would pour the water into the basin and leave. No words, no prayers, just water and time. Years passed, then decades, and not once did anyone speak inside the temple. Children were warned not to run through it. Travelers were directed away from it. Birds never nested on its roof. Moss refused to grow on its walls, And Poseidon, he said nothing. No storms, no signs, no wrath, no blessing. It was as though the god himself had ignored it. Some priests argued this was a good thing, that silence meant satisfaction, that the god had received his offering of stillness and demanded nothing more. But others whispered a different fear. What if Poseidon never came because the temple wasn't real enough? Not grand, not sacred, just clay and doubt. A mistake. Then came the drought, not of rain, but of fog. For the first time in memory, the sea stopped sending its breath inland. The low mist that had marked the seasons softened the harvest, cooled the soil. It vanished. The wells grew briny. Crops withered. Fish spoiled faster in the sun. The village began to fray. And still, no one entered the temple to pray. Not, even then, because they didn't know how. It had been built without ritual, sustained without meaning, a hollow in the shape of reverence, but never filled. That's when an old woman named Merope made a decision. She had been the water bearer once, long ago, chosen at age 10 to carry the seawater bowl. She remembered the weight of it, the sound it made when poured, the strange echo that followed, not from the walls, but from something beneath. Now nearing 60, with cracked hands and a tired back, she walked to the temple alone. No one stopped her. No one followed. Inside, the basin still sat in the center, empty. She knelt beside it and whispered, "I don't know what you want, but we built this for you, and we're still here." Then, for the first time in its history, a prayer was spoken within the still house. The next morning, the fog returned, but not gently. It came in waves, not mist, but thick, heavy vapor, rolling through the fields, pooling into homes, swelling up the steps of the temple. For 3 days, the village disappeared into whiteness. People spoke in hushed tones. Some wept. Others stood at their doors, listening to the sound of moisture dripping from roof thatch, from tree leaves, from their own fingers. And at the center, in the still house, the basin overflowed, though no one had filled. The water was not just seawater. It shimmered oddly. It pulsed, and this time no child was sent to clean it, because now the villagers were afraid for a different reason. The god had heard. This is the part of the story that matters most, not because something terrible happened, but because nothing did. No punishment, no reward, just presence. From that day forward, the still house became something new, not a temple, not a monument, but a place where people waited. They would sit beside the basin and say nothing, or everything. Some wept, some cursed the sea, others simply sat, letting their breath match the rise and fall of the water's surface. The walls remained unadorned, the floor still dusty, but now the silence was earned. So why did no one pray there for so long? Because they thought Poseidon only heard grand gestures, only answered polished altars. They forgot that gods, especially the older ones, don't demand perfection. They demand presence, the kind that lingers, that listens, the kind Merope offered with a cracked voice and uncertain words. That prayer didn't fix the temple. It made it, because reverence isn't in the building. It's in the risk of being honest when silence has lasted too long. Teful, priest with no title. After the fog returned to Thalassian, something subtle changed. People still called the structure the still house, but it no longer felt like a temple built from obligation. It had depth now, not from decorations or incense, but from the weight of what had finally been spoken there. Merope's prayer had broken the silence, not shattered it, but fractured it gently, like a hairline cracking glass that, once seen, changes the whole view. Soon after, others began to visit the still house, quietly, hesitantly. A farmer placed a single shell by the basin and whispered the name of his dead wife. A girl, no older than 12, stood in the doorway for an hour, clutching a braid of seaweed. A travelling potter left a cup of salt water and asked Poseidon to forgive him for a shipwreck that had happened 3 years earlier. One he believed was his fault, though no one else did. The still house became a place of muted rituals. None of it was written. None of it was taught. It simply emerged, as though the structure itself had waited decades for humans to figure out how to use it. And at the center of this quiet blooming stood Eraton. He was a mason by trade, a man of practical hands and modest habits. Eraton had helped repair the still house many years before, patching erosion in the lower corners after a spring flood. At the time, he'd thought of it as just another job, but something about the space had stayed with him. Its simplicity, its stubborn refusal to become sacred, its emptiness, thick with potential. After Merope's visit, he began coming by more often. He didn't claim any role, didn't wear robes. He just sat, swept the floor, refreshed the basin with seawater once a month. Sometimes he sang under, his breath, sea shanties mostly, or lullabies from his mother. People began calling him the basin keeper. He never corrected them. One evening, as autumn drew in and the wind took on the scent of salt and dying leaves, Eraton found Merope sitting in the still house, her back to the wall. She looked tired, not sick, just spent, like a tide finally, returning after years of resisting the pull. "Do you think he's listening?" she asked without turning. Eraton sat beside her. "I think he always was," he said. "We just didn't know what to say." Merope nodded. Or how to mean it. That night, the basin reflected the moon so clearly it looked like a hole in the floor. Neither of them touched it.